Lieber Herr Kardinal, ich dürfte über die letzten viele Jahre unserer Zusammenarbeit oft Vorträge von dir hören, aber ich muss ehrlich gestehen, dass das einer der schönsten ist, der ich von dir je gehört habe, obwohl wir viele schöne Vorträge von dir hören dürften. Das ist eine prachtvolle Einführung in diesem Tag, und was mir insbesondere wirklich gerührt hat, ist der Nachdruck auf der Lehrer als Diener. Ich denke, das ist eine der wichtigsten Sachen, die wir heute aus diesem Tag mitnehmen können. Diener der Wahrheit, wie du gesagt hast. Danke für diese unglaublich tiefgehende Worte, die hätte keine besseren Start sein können für diesen Tag. Und ich freue mich wirklich, dass inzwischen auch der Saal weiter vollgelaufen ist und dass es werden noch ein paar Sessel zugebracht, dass ich unseren nächsten Vortragenden gerne vorstellen darf. Dr. Edward Hadas, we are very happy that you are with us. And Dr. Edward Hadas is a fellow at Blackfriars Hall in Oxford, and he's well known to the ITI. Actually, recently he came here a couple of weeks ago to give a guest lecture. And for those of you who are interested in Catholic social teaching, Edward, 2 years ago or 3 years ago, he published a wonderful book called Counsels of Imperfection, which is a commentary on Catholic social teaching. It's actually one of the books that is on my book table here that I have myself in the meantime also often looked at, because it's an excellent book that really helps us understand in a very systematic way Catholic social teaching. And I really encourage you to have a look at this book. It's really a masterpiece. So with that being said, Edward, we're very happy and very privileged that you have accepted our invitation, and you will speak about universities today, technocracy and truth.
Thank you that's far more praise than I deserve. I'm just going to say that this talk I have written out the text, and if anyone is interested, I can easily send it to you, although it did need to be changed a little. And I have to say that the Cardinal's introduction, for those of you who could follow the German, rather takes away some of the things I was going to say. He's said much better than I could have imagined saying what the ITI is trying to do, so thank you for doing that. So the invitation to come to the ITI for a second time here, as Christian just mentioned, it came around the same time that I received an invitation from a different institution known as WSB University, located in, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, Dąbrowa Górnicza, which is close to Katowice in Poland. And so it was an interesting pairing to me, and in fact I have a audiovisual aid here, one leaflet from each of these universities, that I'm trying to think about these two universities because in a way they have a lot in common. Both of them are located in the heart of Europe, as it says on the ITI's brochure here. They're about 330 kilometers apart. They were both founded roughly at the same time, in large part in both cases, or as they developed, one of their sort of resonances was the changes of Europe after the fall of communism. And both of them have agendas, educational agendas, that might be described as idealist. So 2 institutions, 2 invitations for me, very similar in some ways, and yet very, very different in the most important way. And that difference is the starting point of what I'm going to be talking about. Because basically, they provide radically different interpretations of the German concept of Bildung, which is completely untranslatable into English because it has such a wide range of meanings. And I will use various translations or parts of it as I go on here. So let me compare and contrast. On the one hand, we have the ITI, which is small, not even 100 students at this point. It doesn't aspire to be large. I ask every time I come, how many students do you want? And the number never seems to go much above 120. And its range of expertise has certainly widened since it was just the ITI, International Theological Institute, but it remains well within the range of what Thomas Aquinas would have thought was worthy of learning. And its style of teaching is designed specifically, explicitly, to do what Thomas Aquinas thought learning was supposed to do, to help bring out what is already inside by transferring the good and great knowledge that is available to us thanks to the grace of God. So that's one side, familiar to most of you here. The other side is also familiar to you, although I doubt many of you have heard of WSB University. WSB has 10,000 students and is expanding as fast as it possibly can. It does that by offering as many different degrees as it can in as many different subjects. All of the subjects can be described as technical. Things like human resources management, logistics, medical technology, IT security. And the teaching, the method, and the idea is, I think we can call it fact-based. They want to take facts and hammer them into your head as a student. The facts aim to create skills, but the skills are seen not as something internally generated, but as something that is externally presented and mastered, but not mastered in the kind of sense of a teacher, mastered in the sense of able to do in a reliable way this skill. And the goal explicitly is to help them, the students, in their careers. Some of these 10,000 students come from around the world, from Africa, from Central Asia, and what they want is a degree that will help them be successful, make money, have social status. Deep thinking, which is the fonts, to go to the sources of wisdom here, deep thinking isn't on the agenda. It just isn't relevant to the way that the WSB ethos, the way the university is founded, is not relevant to that way of thinking. Now, as for me, I love to be here. You can invite me anytime, I will come. And I'm very comfortable here. Theology, that's my thing, or one of my things, and philosophy, and all the topics, really. But I have to say, I really enjoyed going off to Silesia and visiting WSB. And I think the reason I enjoyed it so much, besides that everyone was very friendly and supportive, was that I felt like I was an honored visitor from a strange land, almost another planet of the mind. And I was appreciated with a kind of curiosity. Anyone who's read Gulliver's Travels will remember the way that Gulliver is treated as if in the various different countries is sort of a peculiar novelty to be observed like an animal in the zoo. But it was very pleasant being observed because there was a sense there that there was something that I had teaching them about the philosophy of social sciences and economics that they didn't have and that they were missing. But the pairing, though, is very explicit, is very interesting to me. Now, my academic home, as Christian so kindly mentioned, is the University of Oxford. And I would put it somewhere in between these two extremes. So there's one side one side, and me at Oxford in the middle. The reason I say that is that if I were to talk to the administrators and say, we are in the middle between these two schools, some of them would be appalled to be compared to the ITI. They would say, they don't get research grants at the ITI in any big way. They would say, they study such a narrow range of fields. They would say, what kind of success do their graduates have? And they would say, you know, what's it say? It says the mind of the church. Well, Blackfriars is a Catholic hall at the University of Oxford, but I can tell you we live on sufferance. The mind of the church is not central to the Oxford thinking. On the other hand, some of the administrators would be shocked to be compared to WSB. They would say WSB is a mere trade school teaching crafts. And so when you're opposed to the two extremes, it suggests that you're really somewhere in the middle. I should mention that Oxford is so not in the mind of the church that it hasn't had an explicit goal for the last decade to de-Christianize its theology department, to make it more of a department of religion. And that change, the de-Christianizing, is, I think, a sign of a fundamental indifference to the mission, what I would think of as the mission, the teaching, the learning that is done here at the ITI, of, say, to quote someone different, of Anselm's idea of faith-seeking understanding. And I would add, along with the cardinal, seeking understanding through critical thinking, that is, critical in the best sense of wisely trying to deepen our own internal understanding by asking hard questions. Now, when I say that that the Oxford is indifferent to that now, or becoming more indifferent, I don't think that any of those senior administrators I mentioned, even the ones who wouldn't want to be compared to the ITI, none of them would say that they are really opposed. They would never agree with that conclusion. But I think it's fair to note that a commitment to that kind of wisdom, to that kind of liberal art in this traditional sense, is never going to produce the £3 billion budget that Oxford University works on, annual budget. What does produce that kind of money from the government, from various governments, from students, from donors, is in fact success or excellence in the sort of conventional thinking that pleases the elites, the students who are going to be elites, and the elites who allocate money to it. So the political, economic, and cultural elites, the British, American, and global elites want something, and Oxford is determined, the administrators of Oxford, to give it to them. So look, 3 institutions, ITI, Oxford, and WSB, I think we can think of them as exemplars of 3 different visions: a vocational, which I'm going to associate with ITI, and I'll explain in a second, a professional, which I'm going to associate with Oxford, and a technocratic, which I'm going to talk about for WSB. It's the technocratic that really interests me because I think it permeates Oxford to an increasing extent. Now, I want to say for a little caution here that I'm somewhat wary of what is often said about classical learning and the liberal tradition in Western universities. If you look at the history of universities over the century, the 8 or so centuries of their existence, what you find is that a deep commitment to truth, wisdom, and critical debate is relatively rare. On the other hand, intellectual censorship and limited interest in the life of the mind, maximal interest in social achievements have, over the centuries across Europe and the United States and other European outposts, those attributes have been very common. We could look back, because we're in this place, it's the kind of thing that people remember, as it were, 1277, when the University of Paris was forced to deal with the episcopal condemnation of 219, quote, manifest and damned errors that were being propagated at the university. On the other side, the history of German universities in the 18th century is largely of the most imaginative professors being chased from one to the other on grounds of heresy or political insurrection. On the other side, one can look at Oxford, which was what Americans tend to call a party school well into the 19th century, with very little serious intellectual work being done there. And if you look at the history of European sort of intellectuals, Reformation, the 17th, 18th century, the Enlightenment, the Republic of Letters, all of that, very little of it was done by people who had university positions. Very few of the names that remain until the early 19th century were university people. Still, for all that, and I'm seriously cautious about the kind of claims sometimes people make, I think it's fair to say that all the universities, even the party school Oxford, always retained at least some pretense or some portion of presence of what I'm going to call a vocational vision. And I mean using that in the sense of the Latin vocare, to call, that people are called to their inner self, to their knowledge, to learn. Now, we heard yesterday some descriptions of the vocational mission, and I'm going to add two more quotations. The first is from a speech by Pope Francis at a Hungarian university. Christian presented one excerpt from it. But what I wanted to quote is him calling a university, and here's the quote, "a place where thought emerges and develops in a way that is both open and symphonic and never monotonous. It is and he puts in quotes, a temple where knowledge is set free from the constraints of," again, quotes, "accumulating and possessing, and thus can become culture, that is, the cultivation of our humanity and its foundational relationships with the transcendent, with society, with history, and with creation." Thus Pope Francis on the vocation of the university. The second quote is from John Henry Newman, a book that was also quoted yesterday, his description of the idea of a university. That future cardinal said that the faculty of a good university should be, and again I quote, "an assemblage of learned men, zealous for their own sciences, and rivals of each other." That's end quote. Together, these scholars, and here he says, created a pure and clear atmosphere of thought, which the student also breathes. So that's end quote. The student who inhales such thought, quote, apprehends the great outlines of knowledge, the principles on which it rests, the scale of its parts, its lights and its shadows, its great points and its little. And he finishes with what I think is the most important part, and much like the Thomistic vision of learning, a habit of mind is formed which lasts through life, of which the attributes are freedom, equitableness, calmness, moderation, and wisdom. He calls it a philosophical habit. Now, Newman was certainly thinking of the Oxford College, or at least his idealized vision of it, in which a small group of students live amidst a small group of teachers, intellectuals, of various ages, various specialties, styles, and accomplishments. These teachers, who, it should be remembered, were not allowed to marry when Newman wrote. They only could marry in the 1870s. They thus had the freedom to be dedicated to their students as to their own advanced interests. And indeed, for many of what were called senior members of the colleges, their vocation was in fact teaching, not as today, research. What they wanted to do was to formation is another word here for this idea, to form the minds and character of the young. And they developed a particularly effective technique of pedagogy. In Oxford, you call it the tutorial. It's a one-on-one session with students, a dialogue. The student writes an essay. The teacher and the student discuss the essay and the topic that the essay discusses for roughly an hour. And you do this every week. And when the system works well, it really does call, vocat, the students and the teachers to think critically and deeply. Now, for solid economic reasons, which I do not have time to explain, such a here, I can explain it happily another time. For solid economic reasons, such a vocational commitment has become much more expensive since Newman's days. However, for equally solid economic reasons, which I'm not going to explain also, we actually have the resources at a pool that we could pool to make such an education much more available if we so choose, we, the society. And I would say that we could afford to do that for everyone, but that would be very expensive. We'd have to divert resources from other activities, so sort of more vocation, fewer vacations. But we could also just give the most eager and incompetent 1 or 3 or 5 or even 10% of the young people that sort of vocational education without much economic disruption. But we, as a society, make a social choice not to make such a commitment. And that decision not to be interested in vocational education flows seamlessly into the thinking of the top administrators at Oxford University. They're anxious, they're desperate for money. If you talk to them for a few minutes, that's exactly the issue that will come up. But that money isn't meant to go to improving or even to maintaining the depth and quality of undergraduate education. If you said to them, and especially undergraduate education in the liberal arts, maybe in sciences. Now, if you said to them, I've got £10 million or $20 million to give for undergraduate education, they probably would accept it, although there was a debate over one of the other Catholic halls in Oxford that suggests they're not actually that even interested when there's a lot of money behind it, if it's not going to be the right kind of education. But what you would hear if you wanted to give money is they'd say, no, that's not that important. Let's do tuition subsidies for poor people. Let's do research positions. Let's do hiring very famous professors, name brand professors who will never give more than a few token undergraduate tutorials. So that's where their heart is. Where their money goes is where their heart is. Where their treasure is, there is their heart. And that's not unusual. It's not that Oxford's somehow wicked. The social choice that is made about university education has not been vocational in the sense that I'm using the word. For a long time, it has been professional. Now, professional education at universities starts way back in the Middle Ages, law and medicine, and it increased rapidly and dramatically in the 19th and 20th centuries with the need for more engineers, basically. And the universities took up that call for engineering. And that's accelerated in the last half century. At non-elite universities, business studies is most often the dominant field. WSB, that's certainly true. And what's happened in terms of professional education is that even fields that might have been considered the liberal arts are increasingly professional. For example, economists still learn a lot of theory, most of which is useless, not just useless in practice, but useless in theory. It's theory that's bad. But they also now increasingly learn how to do practical things, mostly statistical analysis. Or politics, which used to be a kind of philosophy, let's think about the good state in one way or another, is now considered a degree that you use to get into the political world. It's a professional training. Or sociology, and that sort of human science is now redivided in ways to find a career qualification. Now, I'm not criticizing these developments, and the university years are not exactly criticizing them. University years are often the appropriate ones for inculcating the remarkably wide range of professional skills that we need to operate modern economies. And universities are arguably, I think well argued, the most appropriate institutions for such professional inculcation. They know how to arrange curriculums, they know how to hammer things into people's heads, and a good university like Oxford does more than hammering, it does help you think a bit. And they're good at testing, and they have a tradition of giving out certificates that are respected by employers. Universities are also arguably the most sensible place to do a lot of research, the kind of research that isn't going to be profitable right away. And at Oxford, if you look at where the money goes, so where their heart is, more of it goes to research, far more than to undergraduate education. This is part of that cycle that I mentioned of status giving, and it's also part of the way people look at the world. I have an aunt who teaches creative writing, and every time I think about getting a degree in creative writing, it's not much of a career builder, but people like degrees. It's part of the modern world. So we have a simultaneous social choice against vocational education and in favor of professional education. And so making those choices, what we have is universities like Oxford are increasingly professional universities. And that has changed the nature of these universities in a subtle but crucial way. As long as it was good enough to offer a degree that your status of being a Harvard graduate or an Oxford graduate got you the social position that you might want, then there would be no real necessary conflict between vocational and professional education. But as the shift has come so that increasingly the status doesn't come from the degree alone, from the institution alone, but from the degree, from the specialized skills. So, although I don't think Oxford offers refrigeration engineering, he is an Oxford graduate in politics increasingly means that he has gained a certain kind of professional skill at politics, and decreasingly means he's an Oxford man or she's an Oxford woman. And as that shift continues, the vocational ambition of the university, or within the university, becomes more and more secondary or superfluous or even damaging. Too many questions get in the way of a lot of kind of skill building. And so if you're running a university from the professional perspective, the idea of your institution is primarily helping the young develop and find and then develop their vocations. It looks outdated. For one thing, the majority of students aren't even young, particularly. Most of the students at Oxford, a solid 60%, are postgraduates. Many of them are middle-aged, people in mid-career picking up new skills and certificates. Most of the employees are not teachers, they're researchers and administrators. And in many ways, if you look at Oxford as an institution, and this is what's been said to me by the people administering it, it has more in common with a corporation or a government agency than with the Oxford of a century ago. Now, I'm not exactly criticizing that shift. I'm not happy about it, but I recognize that universities follow the social choices of the societies in which they exist. And to wish otherwise is an idle dream. So Oxford does what its masters tell us. It doesn't tell truth to power, and indeed, increasingly, these universities tell power to truth. They reshape a vision of truth as the powerful people want them to. And what I would see in the way that they respond is what Pope Francis calls the technocratic paradigm. Now let's think about paradigms. The idea, the word was introduced into intellectual history by Thomas Kuhn, a 20th century American historian of science. And what he meant was a framework that determines what questions can be asked, what methods can be used to think about how those questions are answered, and what responses to those questions can be considered sensible or acceptable. And this technocratic paradigm is the technocratic paradigm that Francis is talking about is as intellectual, it shapes the intellectual life as the ones that Kuhn discussed in physics and various parts of the sciences, biology. But the technocratic paradigm goes past the intellectual life. It extends to much of our contemporary culture. Inside that paradigm, what do we think about? What's it allowed? We think about things in terms of human power over the natural world. We think about individual and immediate pleasures, the individualism that was discussed yesterday. We think of quantities rather than qualities. We think in terms of bureaucratic organizations, and we think a lot in terms of technical, professional expertise. So the paradigm, as it takes over more of society, pushes old universities such as Oxford to abandon vocation and wisdom, which are really totally irrelevant to technocratic thinking. And the prevalence of this paradigm provides fertile ground for new universities that were never encumbered by this sort of commitment. And give credit to the founders of WSB. They recognized that a modernizing, and that means increasingly technocratic Poland, and as they expanded a technocratic world, would pay a good price for an entirely functional and highly specialized professional education. Technocratic paradigm has much more in it than talking about education. I've written about that. You can find it on that technocratic triumph, the internet, what I've said. But I'm going to say 10 things about it that are relevant to education. First, it craves data. When you're thinking within it, technocratic thinking craves data. You collect and collate pure facts, especially countable and measurable facts that can be understood and interpreted with as little theory, especially with as little non-numerical theory, as possible. And universities now are expected to find and curate all sorts of data, from ancient manuscripts that should be digitalized, to experiments on the responses of commercially bred fish to different feeding regimes, to the intergenerational effects of deworming in different villages in Kenya. All three of those are examples that have come across my email in the last few weeks. There's another Hadas who does fish nutrition, so I see his work regularly. Second, technocratic thinking is constitutionally unaware of beauty. I have a friend who collects data on what scientists say about beauty, but he has to do interviews to find out because they never talk about beauty, not publicly. For them, most of them, it was a secret vice that they found beauty in their scientific work. As a conduit to the divine, beauty may be ultimately, I hope so, I believe so, it may be more powerful than technocracy, but it has no place in a technocratic education. Third, technocratic thinking does not have space for problems that cannot eventually be solved. Such thinking does not, it cannot pose the great questions that inspired philosophy, theology, literature, the topics that are studied at the ITI, and that frame any vocational education, the questions about being, about justice, God, evil, the good life, so forth. At best, technocratic research can gather data about how people ask and answer such questions. At worst, as in a certain kind of technocratic philosophy, the very questions are rejected as inappropriate to a contemporary university. We're here to study business or chemistry or history or language in a philosophical, mechanical way. the right relationship to God, it's not our affair. Fourth, technocratic thinking is inherently bureaucratic. Just as machines work better from a technocratic perspective when the parts are interchangeable and the functioning is carefully controlled, human systems, as we hear about in technoland, work better when they rely on offices and rules and record keeping, not on friendships and shared commitments or subjective judgments or the poorly controlled jostling of virtues and vices. And technocratic universities then are human systems with a high potential to lose the technocratic plot, perhaps by becoming more dangerously vocational. So they have vast bureaucracies to ensure that processes and procedures are followed correctly. Fifth, the technocratic paradigm fits poorly with the reality of humanity. Homo technocraticus is fine with pleasure-seeking, with problem-solving, rule-setting, and career planning. But she has no, Homo technocraticus has no, lost my place here, has no grandeur, no misery, no confusion of passions and enthusiasm, no moral or spiritual struggles. A well-run technocratic university will have limited tolerance for any passions that are disruptive, illogical, or not socially approved. Sixth, technocratic thinking rejects wonder and wisdom. Intellectual work is fine as long as it solves problems, but any sentiment of wonder must quickly be translated into questions that can be answered in objectively verifiable ways. Seventh, technocratic thinking is often ideological and extreme. When you deny beauty, wisdom, and, as I will discuss soon, truth, you don't only get vast quantities of data, narrow technical knowledge, although you certainly get those, you get the non-recognition of what theologians sometimes call the natural human craving for the supernatural. And that emptiness leaves technocrats vulnerable to simplifying and totalizing ways of thinking. History and politics are reduced to power, justice is reduced to politics, economics reduced to greed, and love is reduced to sex. Eighth, technocratic thinking aims at the production of knowledge, not at the reproduction of culture. The goal of collecting data is to analyze it into bits of knowledge which can be put to practical use. Produce more knowledge. It produces professionals who have and can use this knowledge in a relevant way. There's neither time for nor comprehension of non-technocratic care needed for the continuation of traditions. The ninth comment is that almost all universities, including Oxford, have enthusiastically endorsed technocratic thinking. Sure, there are residues of the vocational calling, but in reality, those are very fading and going away. And what you see is more and more students going into subjects where they find they're just doing this technocratic thing. I met a woman on the airplane coming here who studied biology 10 years ago. She remembered nothing about biology. She remembered nothing about how she was taught to think. But it had dulled her mind, I can tell you that. She would be offended, I'm sure, but she won't know. Finally, and more optimistically, the victory of the technocratic university over the vocational education is never total. As I found out at WSB, even an institution with no vocational tradition and with an exclusively technocratic mission cannot escape some inchoate, unformed sense that the real university should offer some kind of course that develops character, develops hearts, souls, and minds, as well as those certifiable skills. In any university, young people are there, and some of them even crave a vocational formation. And there are always some teachers and some administrators even who would like to provide it. Okay, I don't have much more time, but I will finish with the other half of my title, Technocracy and Truth. The pursuit of something that might be called truth is central to all three of my types of education: vocational, professional, and technocratic. The vocation to truth is obviously at the center of vocational thinking, and the truth there is understood as something transcendental or divine. And insofar as vocation universities were, and perhaps even might still be, vocational, they presented the truth of Christian revelation in theology and the truth of God found in his creation in philosophy and the various sciences. That doesn't mean that they agree on what the truth is. There's lots of arguments, rivalries, as Newman says. But looking backward from our secular age, the disagreements seem far more superficial than the agreement, that the one agreement that there is a truth which, or as Christians know, who call all people to and through knowledge. In practice, Christian universities often ignored their vocational responsibility, but even the most careless university student or administrator up to at least the 18th or 19th century would have at least accepted the probable existence, goodness, and importance of truth. Truth is still somewhere in the background of a lot of educational programs, but the loss of the Christian glory has probably dulled the truth that they're talking about. Turning to professional education, truth certainly plays a role, but the truth in question is much more pragmatic than inspirational. Certification in a profession usually requires some sort of promise of personal integrity, but what the integrity means, based on some notion of truth, is rarely understood. You can see this in the decline of medicine as a healing art. So what we get instead of truth is ethical standards, specific practices, rules. It's a kind of truth, but reduced. Now, technocracy has its own idea of truth. It's certainly not based on a human or universal goal or good. Those things aren't relevant. It's not that technocracy promotes falsehood. It's that it has a very pragmatic and rules-based approach to everything, including truth. What counts as true is simply what works for the modest goals that technocracy endorses. Problem avoidance techniques and even convenient lies are likely to be preferred to inconvenient truths in technocratic thinking. Indeed, inside the technocratic paradigm, the noble lies of, say, that Plato talks about or introduces, those have troubled philosophers for centuries, but they present no real problem to the technocrat inside the paradigm. They may have a practical problem that the lies cannot be sustained, but there's no ethical or ontological problem. If people can continually be persuaded that banks are sound, that governments are competent and well-intentioned, or that the students should themselves are or should be happy, angry, or frightened, then any recognition of a different reality, what we might say is a truer reality, closer to the truth, such a recognition is a threat to the technocratic understanding of the true common good. So universities have to choose their truth. And at Oxford, I'm going to skip this a little bit here. What you see, though, in this technocratic teaching is that the students are very happy inside, at least consciously. Most of the students, they really want to be technocrats. An Oxford degree would get you a nice job, even if you didn't get lots of qualifications. That still is good enough. But people don't want a good enough Oxford degree. They want first-class honors. They want a job at Goldman Sachs. They want a job at the top institutes. They want to do research. And so they become technocrats. They lose any sense of the value of truth in their own lives and otherwise. And of course, if you're trying to raise money, well, so let's stop there and move on to the ITI, at the other end of this trend, the opposite of the technocratic way of thinking. This description that I've given you should be both discouraging and encouraging. It's discouraging because the goals of this institution of vocational education and the promotion of truth, Christian truth, those goals receive so little social respect. The elite is not behind them. And that means that ITI is always going to have to prove itself outside of the Christian community. And it means that ITI graduates can't expect that their degree is going to give them a lot of cachet in the real world, the outside world. Real world, well, we won't say what's real. They're likely to be told that their degree, their education was useless. And many donors who like higher education will stay away. But this picture should also be encouraging. Because if I'm right to think that young people, at least some of them to some degree, are still open to, indeed sometimes actually crave a vocational education, then there is indeed space for the ITI and similar institutions, even inside a society that's dominated by the technocratic paradigm. That thinking is so dominant that the number of students who want such an education is always going to be small in our current society. But there's a virtue in that failure because small institutions are better for building up the mutually reinforcing collectives that Peter talked about so well yesterday. And the idea of mixing professional vocation with professional education with vocational education that was standard in Oxford and other universities has now less realistic in a vocational university such as the ITI because it doesn't have the kind of technocratic professional training that is what people want. And again, that's also not a bad thing. It allows for a kind of purity of education. And the ITI's focus on the liberal arts allows for coherent education, and that brings you closer education in, with, and towards the fullness of truth. So those are small but very significant comforts, and I hope that that's been a helpful lecture. Thanks very much.